I'm Jamie Fly. I'm the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. I want to welcome everyone today. Thank you for coming to our two-panel conference on democratization in the Middle East, implications of the Arab Spring. For those of you not familiar with the Foreign Policy Initiative, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to the promotion of U.S. international engagement. We have several events throughout the year like this, and we also put out a number of other products and information about different foreign policy issues. You all should have received a folder today which has a number of our papers and open letters that we issue. I want to draw your attention to two recent letters that we've released, two open letters to President Obama regarding Libya, including one that came out yesterday. So you may find that to be interesting. We decided to do this conference because we wanted to frame the topic in a way that we could get beyond just kind of the daily discussion about specific countries. Libya is obviously in the news right now. Weeks ago it was Egypt, and discuss kind of broader trends about what's going on in the region with this Arab Spring that we've been seeing. So we are going to focus on some of the recent developments in each case, but also have a broader discussion about what's happening and what are the implications for U.S. policy. We're going to do that through two panels. The first is titled The Middle East and Transformation. And then we'll have a coffee break, and then at 2:30 we'll start with a panel on implications for U.S. policy. I'm going to turn it over now to Robert Kagan, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and one of our board members of the Foreign Policy Initiative, and he's going to introduce our panelists and get the discussion going.
Great, thanks, Jamie, and welcome to all of you. I don't know what it is with the front seats here. I guess it's frightening to be so close to us, but by the end you'll warm up, I think. Obviously, this is a timely discussion, and although we will be addressing broad topics, I think the broad topics have immediate implications. This is one of those moments in history that doesn't come along that frequently. I think it's very much akin to 1989 and the revolutions that we saw in Eastern Europe. Its impact, I think, on American foreign policy, American interests, and the world more generally will be as significant as 1989 as we look back on it. Unfortunately, I think things are very much up for grabs right now, what direction things are going in. Our two esteemed experts will go into that in greater detail. But a lot is riding on where things go now for the United States, and I would say also for President Obama. I think his reputation in foreign policy will be made or unmade on this issue. Presidents don't get to choose which issues define them, unfortunately, but they do have a way of creeping up and defining them. I think this is going to be a tremendous opportunity for President Obama, but also obviously a time of tremendous risk. So that having been said, let me first of all introduce both Michelle Dunn and Ruel Gerecht. I don't think, quite honestly, there are two better experts and scholars on this subject in the country or in the world. Michelle has a distinguished career in government, worked in the White House and the State Department, has a PhD in Arabic studies, something like that. What do you have a PhD in?
Arabic language.
Arabic language, even, which is always helpful, and knows this region incredibly well. She's also co-chair of the working group on Egypt, which had actually been warning about what we've seen in Egypt for quite some time. Next to Michelle is Ruel Gerecht, also worked in the government, also a leading scholar, and I would say the most original scholar and thinker on evolution in the Islamic world, and particularly as it relates to the relationship between Islam and democracy. He has a new book coming out, but it's not listed. Is it listed here? What is it called?
The Wave.
The Wave, okay.
Man, God, and the Ballot Box.
And when is that coming out?
Well, they tell me 3 weeks.
3 weeks, just in time. Needless to say, this is one of those books that was written before everything that happened, but it's not going to come out until after everything that happened.
Right.
You got to get that timing just right. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm going to turn it over to Michelle first for a few minutes of opening remarks, and then Ruel, and then I will pose some questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So, Michelle, thanks very much.
Okay. Well, looking at the region broadly and what's going on there, and here I'm speaking primarily of the Arab countries. To me, what's been going on for some time now is that the societies and the governments have been going in two different directions. More specifically, the societies in a lot of Arab countries have been really experiencing a lot more vitality, activism, and so forth over the last 5 to 10 years, notably, while the governments have been stagnant and sort of, unable to evolve. So we've seen this gap opening up. And that has presented quite a dilemma for the United States as it's become increasingly difficult to be on both sides at once, and the United States has had a lot of trouble choosing which side it's on. Most of the Arab countries have been operating for a long time on a model of leadership in which political power is concentrated in the hands of one person, whether it's a monarch or a president, but that person is not freely elected, not accountable via the ballot box. That person remains in office for life, or at least for many years. And in most cases, that person chooses his successor, in many cases, a son. And in most Arab countries, the parliaments have very little power and judiciaries don't have that much independence. Now, it varies a little bit from one country to another. There are some exceptions to this rule, but this is just sort of describing the general picture. And I would say what we're seeing is that this model is dying. It may not be completely dead yet, but it's on its way out. And that leaders in just about every Arab country have felt the push to change in one, either go or to change in one way or another. And we see them responding in various ways. And I guess we'll be discussing that, how they're responding. Now, the protests and the demanders of protesters in various Arab countries have differed a little bit from one place to another, but there are some very important common threads. One of them is that protesters have started connecting all different kinds of grievances. A lot of them were economically based grievances. We know about the youth bulge and youth unemployment and so forth. Economic grievances, social grievances, human rights grievances have become connected to political grievances. And that wasn't the case in a lot of places until recently. And we've seen larger numbers of people get behind specific grievances and unite behind a goal of changing the political system in some way, whether that involved changing the leadership or carrying out significant reforms. And this is specifically what is challenging this model that I mentioned of, an unelected, all-powerful executive and relatively powerless elected bodies and legislatures. Now, I guess we're going to get a little bit more. I was going to say some things about specific countries.
Go ahead.
I guess we'll get into that a little bit more. But obviously, we're seeing a lot of difference in terms of how strong protests are in various countries, how the leaderships are responding to them. And we've only seen two countries that are actually on the road to transition, Tunisia and Egypt. They're very, very, very important. Egypt especially so. And I guess we'll have a chance to discuss that more.
Okay, good. Well, we can get down to specifics, which actually will flesh out what the general argument is as well. But why don't you go ahead, Ruel, and then we can work into that.
Well, just to dovetail with what Michelle said, I just focus on one little issue, and then we can go from there, and that is, the role that Islamists are going to play, and the great fear that so many have of them in the Middle East. I'd say this, I am astonished when I talk to some of my old professors who are enormously knowledgeable about the region, and I feel as if they're frozen in time, and I feel that the discussion about the Middle East, and particularly Islam in the Middle East, is stuck somewhere between 1948 and 1979. And that we haven't really gotten over the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and it has distorted our view of what I think is taking place, certainly throughout the Arab world and definitely in Iran. And the most important thing to remember is that the Islamists have, like everybody else in the region, have been going through this enormous evolution. in that if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood today, there is no way you can compare it to the Muslim Brotherhood when it was originally formed, or even the Muslim Brotherhood from 30 years ago. Now, we do not know where various Islamist organizations in the Arab world are going to go, all right? But we do have a very good idea, for example, where Islamist groups, Islamist intellectuals have gone in Iran. Now, the Iranians have had the benefit of a revolution. That definitely causes the mind to think in certain ways. But one thing is certainly clear that we've seen in Iran, and that is there are relatively few Islamist intellectuals left. That those that embraced, that made the revolution, most of them have fallen away from the central truths of the revolution. They've certainly backed away from the idea of theocracy. Now, I think if you look at the Arab world is not nearly as rich in the discussion about these issues, about man and God, that we've seen in the Iranian world. The Iranian world is just unique in the quantity of the discussion, the depth of the discussion, the richness of the discussion. But if you do look at the Arab world, you can see it. You can see them trying to, Islamists primarily having to struggle with the idea of what do you do with the democratic mandate? What do you do with the Sharia? How do you adjust? And to put it very briefly, there is this general consensus that I think has developed, and that is that sovereignty can only come through the ballot box. Now, Islamists can argue about what laws should be, supreme, what things in the Sharia must we have, and if we don't have them, the society is in deep doo-doo. But the notion that a vote must take place, that there is no political order which is legitimate without a vote, I think is now almost uniform. And the discussion that you often have in the West where it says, oh, really, what the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is after is establishing a caliphate, and they don't really want to get involved in the democratic process. I just suggest to you, it's surreal. It's not true. Now, that doesn't mean that the Muslim Brotherhood are going to be liberal Democrats. It doesn't mean the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be in favor of the United States. It doesn't say the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be in favor of Western social rights. Far from it. But it is now deep inside of the political body that, in fact, they believe that democracy is the only way to go and that they need to participate in that. And I would just suggest that the primary problem we have in the Middle East is not the threat of some type of Islamist menace. It is the old regimes, the military and security apparatuses in each of these countries that will fight tenaciously to keep essentially the old order if you just cosmetically change it with the new. It's not the Islamists. What you want to see happen, if you fear Islamists, what you want to see happen is actually the democratic process to advance much more rapidly. You want to see elections. You want to see people have to write constitutions. And you want to see them have to confront all of these challenges. And what we have had, I mean, it's important to note, I mean, when I was going to school in Egypt in the late 70s and early 80s, if you'd gone to the American University in Cairo at that time, you didn't see any women veiling. These were the elite members of the society, and they were all decked out and wonderful, sexy, provocative clothing. If you go back to the American University today, after the great and glorious dictatorship of Mubarak, you find astonishingly members of the elite, women, who have all the perks in life, who are voluntarily veiling. Now, why do they do that? Now, religious cosmology aside, which differs from individual to individual, I just suggest to you that's happening because these women of the elite feel fundamentally ashamed of the current social political order. They are moving away from it. This process will continue if you have dictatorship, if you have authoritarian societies. It's only in that order that you actually do not have the type of evolution that we would like to see. What you want to see is you want to see a democratic system where they start arguing about these things. You want to see a democratic system where women of faith argue against women of secular disposition. You want to see that conflict. You want to see the head-on collisions. You want to see the debates get really nasty. the best debate that I could possibly imagine in the Egyptian parliament, the debate that would matter the most, is for them to have a debate, for example, about the treaty with Israel. That is something that is really valuable. You want to see them have a major, ugly debate about social questions, about the role of women, about Sharia. You want to see them have a tug of war and see how this comes out. It's entirely possible that some of these debates might not turn the way that we want them to turn. But I just suggest to you that in the long run, and maybe even the short run, it's going to be a lot better than anything we've seen before. And I would just note, I mean, in 1979, I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of women in Iran were all in favor of Khomeini, all right? And that is particularly true as you move it up the socioeconomic ladder. It is beyond a shadow of a doubt that if women actually, if their votes mattered, all right, the Islamic Republic as we know it would no longer exist. Now, it didn't take really all that long for the evolution to occur. And I just suggest to you that the evolution in the democratic world, in the Arab world, could be, if you actually do get this ball rolling, could be even much more rapid. It's entirely possible. It will certainly, I think, give results. It will make people responsible, and you'll likely see outcomes that may not be the ideal outcome for everybody in the West of a liberal disposition, but will be an outcome which the majority of Arabs in each country can live with, and live with sufficiently well that you'll stop viewing the region as being permanently unstable. You'll stop viewing the region as being a giant generator of violence. And I think that is fundamentally what we want. We want to see the region where the people themselves have responsibility, and that basic instability that we've seen, which I think at root comes from a profound belief that all of these societies are unjust. That's really what it's about, is that from society to society to society, there is a basic sense of that the whole order is wrong. And I think the only way you get away from that is through the ballot box. And I just suggest to you that the vast majority of people there are quite willing to go there and quite sincerely want to test the whole system at the ballot box.
Well, thanks a lot. There's a lot to ask. Let me press you on one thing, though, this last point that you were making. I mean, isn't it an illusion, or isn't it a mistake to tell people that there is a stability lying ahead of us? Isn't it possible that there is no stability, that we're going to... Sam Huntington, who said a lot of things I didn't agree with, did say something smart about modernization, which is it's the change to change. It's the movement away from stasis to change. And couldn't we be entering a period of continual change and experimentation?
Oh, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, I think this process is going to be very convulsive. And as I said, I think you want to see that. I don't think, I mean, you want the Muslim world, you want the Arab world to sort of deal with modernity much more aggressively than it's been able to so far. I mean, there was this notion in the 1940s and the 1950s that sort of the Arab world could modernize basically on a Turkish model. That you could do it from the top down, and you would have dictatorships, and they'd bring in, and it would evolve eventually into a more liberal order. We haven't seen that, actually. We've seen the opposite of that. And so you need to actually have this change, which is going to be convulsive, I think, to get to the end of this. But there's no doubt that that process could be very disruptive, and you're going to have, I would predict, a great deal of difficulty for American foreign policy.
Well, as much as we're tempted to have general conversations, we are dealing with specific situations where all this is in fact evolving. So maybe we should take a look at some specific countries, and let's focus on at least, I think what we agree is certainly the most important country as far as the success or failure of the Arab Spring is concerned, and that's Egypt. Let me get back to Ruel, because I do want to, let's put your thesis to the test and say what is going on with the Muslim Brotherhood right now. But before we get, and I'll pose that question in a second, but before we get to that, where do you see things going now, right this minute and in the months to come, Michelle? What kind of process do you think Egypt ought to go through? What kind of process do you think it is likely to go through?
Well, I think the most important thing to know is that Egypt is in a continuing revolution. I mean, it's not that it was over, you know, on February 11th when Mubarak was forced out of office. This is a process that's going on, and things are changing a lot week by week in Egypt. So, Egypt has a military council, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, that is in effect sitting in place of the presidency until elections are held, and both houses of parliament have been dissolved. The leadership, the transitional leadership did, I think, probably the most important thing they've done since asking Mubarak to step aside yesterday, which was they dissolved the internal security apparatus, the state security investigations apparatus. This is not the regular police and so forth. These are the secret police. And they've said that some sort of new, much more limited body is going to be formed in its place, and it's not going to be getting involved in peaceful politics and in the personal lives of citizens and so forth. Now we'll have to see, but at least, you know, announcing this change is a very important step, because if that had not changed, even if they had managed to hold free elections and so forth, but the secret police had still been there getting involved in everybody's lives and harassing and torturing people and so forth, then there would have been no change. So that was really an essential step. And Tunisia did the same thing just about a week before that. That's really important. The other big important question now is the Constitution and the related question of elections. What the military leadership in Egypt wants to do is a very limited constitutional reform and then move very quickly to presidential and parliamentary elections. And it's not clear exactly what order they would be held in. The way the Constitution puts it, they should hold parliamentary elections first and then the presidential elections afterwards. But there's a lot of concern on the part of protesters and opposition forces in Egypt about moving very quickly to elections. There are all kinds of new political forces springing up. I mean, I'm literally hearing about one or more new political parties that are trying to form every day. And of course, they don't have time to organize themselves for elections in 3 months or even 6 months. The thing that's going to happen later this week is they're going to have a referendum on Saturday, unless for some reason they should cancel it, on a limited group of constitutional amendments that would basically just pave the way for holding free and fair parliamentary elections, but wouldn't carry out any basic changes in the political system. What we're seeing is a lot of the political forces in Egypt saying they're against a limited constitutional amendment, and they would rather go down a different path, which is what Tunisia is now doing, which is scrap the whole constitution, convene a constituent assembly, and write the Constitution over again and have sort of a longer, slower process before elections are actually held. The military council in Egypt doesn't want to do this because they want to hand over power. They're actually not eager to hold on to political power for, at least not overt political power, for a long time. So this is the struggle. We're going to have to see. It's really very hard to predict what's going to happen at this referendum on Saturday, because Egypt literally has never held a free election before. You don't know how many people are going to vote. In past referenda, you would have 5% or fewer of eligible voters turning out. Now you have 45 million people eligible to vote. And if a lot of them, half or even a third of them turn out, I think it's going to be really difficult to handle. If the constitutional referendum passes this weekend, then they'll be on a path to holding elections, and there may be some negotiation about sort of which order they're held in and how many months. I think it would be better to hold the presidential election first. It's less complicated than the parliamentary elections. But if the referendum doesn't pass, then they may have to scrap this whole plan and move toward a constituent assembly or something like that. And in that case, the protesters and the opposition are going to push very hard for a change in the leadership, that it not be a military council alone that lead the country through the transitional period, but that there be a different kind of a presidential council that involves civilians along with the military.
Great. Well, that's very helpful. I take it you think the United States is right not to be opining on these issues.
Right. I mean, look, I think, the United States, needs to be, continuing to talk about the need for a real transition, continuing to talk about the need for the military leadership to be responsive to, to the demands, and they're changing, they're evolving all the time, that we're seeing from the protesters and the opposition, and that the military leadership should not be, rigid in the kind of timetable and so forth that it puts in place. I wanted to say one word about what Ruel said about the Islamists, which I agree with, and. Look, you're absolutely right that there's been a big change in the Islamists, and that the idea of democratic government is now widely accepted. I'm thinking of a long series of books that the Islamist intellectual, you probably know him, Fahmy Houedi in Egypt, wrote this, 10-volume series called Islam and Democracy about a decade ago, trying to convince Islamists that democratic government was consonant with Islam. Nobody would write that anymore because the argument's over. We keep having the argument here about them, but amongst themselves, in fact, this argument is over. When you get into the fine points, the argument still goes on, and I agree it's a productive argument and it needs to go on. I also would point out, I said at the beginning of my talk that society had been on the move in Arab countries, and one of the ways in which it's been on the move is that there is a liberal trend. If you look 20 years ago or 10 years ago, to be a serious oppositionist in an Arab country meant to be an Islamist. That's not necessarily the case anymore. Islamists, are a significant part of the opposition, but they have a lot more competition now from different political groups, and especially from liberals.
Well, let's talk about the Brotherhood and what they're doing right now. I know some very suspicious Republican friends of mine are saying they're playing it perfectly. They're trying not to look threatening, and then they go off on a long stream about how the Bolsheviks and this and all that. One thing that does seem to be interesting is the at least de facto alliance between the military government and the Brotherhood on how to proceed. Most of the opposition groups are opposing the referendum. The Brotherhood seems to be favoring it. They seem to be favoring this process. I've also at least read about younger members of the Brotherhood not necessarily wanting there to be only one party. Maybe there should be more than one Islamist party. What is happening right now with the Brotherhood in Egypt?
That's a great question. I think the Brotherhood is in a serious state of convulsion in the sense that I don't think they really know where they're going. If you look at someone like Mohammed Badia, the head of the Brotherhood, the man is about, as I would argue, as lost about where the future of Egypt is as is the Minister of Defense. That both of them have about the same level of clairvoyance. So I think the Brotherhood has benefited, obviously, to say what should be obvious, is they've benefited enormously from the situation that in Egypt under Mubarak. They really were the only, quote, legitimate opposition, you might say. And if you really did want to demonstrate against the regime, the Brotherhood was the place to go. It was a place where you could actually find people of differing views, and you could find people who weren't paid off by the regime. All of that is over now. So, we have certainly seen younger members of the Brotherhood, express their, limited dismay with senior members of the Brotherhood. Now, we haven't seen a big, wide open debate. I think we've seen signs of that there are definitely fissures, that if you had a more open system, then those fissures might turn into giant cracks and you could have a lava flow. But until it actually moves forward, I think the discipline of the Brotherhood will probably be sufficient to maintain many of the conspiracies that many people cherish, that the Brotherhood is in fact this organization that's quite capable of stealing the entire political system. I don't think that's true, though I will be very frank. I think the Brotherhood, if it plays its cards correctly and can get younger people out there, that the Brotherhood has the chance of doing pretty well in any election. I would be shocked if they got less than 25%. And I think it's conceivable that they could get upwards of 40%. So I think it's a mistake. I mean, these societies, and I mean, I agree with Michelle, these societies, the liberal element, particularly in Egypt, is a lot greater than I think many people have given credit. That the liberal traditions in Egypt, I think, though battered badly, I think can recover fairly quickly. But with that said, one must say that Egypt is a profoundly conservative society. It's a very conservative social society, and the Brotherhood is going to, and religious parties in general, we'll see what happens with the Brotherhood down the road, how vociferous it is, can do well. So we should not be shocked to see the Brotherhood do a lot better than what some people in Egypt say it will do, and that is, 10 or 15% of the vote. If they only get 10 or 15% of the vote, I mean, then, pop the champagne bottles, because then you really do have a much more competitive society than I think is the case.
Let's finish up on Egypt by talking a little bit about U.S. policy. I had the impression, being here, that although it was a close-run thing, that ultimately President Obama wound up on the right side of Egypt, and that we weren't caught sticking to Mubarak right up to the bitter end as we were with the Shah. However, I get the sense that that is not necessarily the view in Egypt. So I'd like to ask you about that. And then as a second question, maybe Michelle, you can address that. And as a second question, there is you hear an awful lot in the United States Congress and probably in the inner council of the administration on what the United States can do to sort of limit the power of the Brotherhood in any eventual Egyptian government. So I wanted to get your response to that. But what about how would you say Obama and his actions are viewed now in Egypt across the political spectrum?
Well, I mean, we saw today and yesterday how Secretary Clinton's words and actions were viewed when, a group of the revolutionary youth refused to meet with her because of some of the statements she had made. Now, I don't know to what extent they're going to differentiate President Obama from that. I am concerned that, when the history of this is written, right, it's going to be boiled down to one sentence. Did the United States support the Egyptian revolution or didn't it? And I'm worried that right now the narrative in Egypt more is that it didn't. Or that it was, too lukewarm in its support, because, we saw here how carefully the administration was, turning up its rhetoric, 1 degree at a time, day by day, and the inconsistencies in many cases between what the White House said and what State or Defense said, and so forth. I don't think that that kind of process, which was our own, Washington process that had to be gone through, it doesn't get across a megaphone into Tahrir Square very well. I think that President Obama ultimately ended up in the right place, and it was just about a week before Mubarak. Or about a week before Mubarak actually left office, that I thought Obama said clearly, we're going to be in favor of democracy in Egypt. And I did see a change in the administration once he had said it more clearly. And I think they're trying to proceed that way. But I do think there are a lot of questions in Egypt still about that. And as far as the people who were behind the revolution, the United States is still on trial as far as whether we favor this or not.
And U.S. policy vis-a-vis the Brotherhood? Should we have a policy?
I think it would be a really bad idea if the United States adopted a policy of supporting restrictive democracy, to borrow a phrase from a friend of mine. That I think that's definitely going down the long road. The United States should make its views clear It should articulate without any hesitation and forcefully the type of democracy that we would like to see in Egypt and the type of democracy that we ourselves cherish. But I do think that we should not design, even if we could, some type of policy where we make it, where we basically say, you know, if you vote for the Brotherhood, you're the enemy of the United States. I think that's a bad idea. So I think it is for the Egyptians to make up their own minds. We want to see the great debates. I mean, we should not be scared of those debates. And I often have the view that folks, particularly on the right, are scared of having to let Egyptians have full reign. That we're scared that when Muslims actually have full reign that they're going to run amok. Well, I would just suggest to you the only way they won't run amok is to let them actually have full reign. The only way this develops is that people become responsible. And the only way you counter the terribly baleful effect of conspiracy in the Middle East, of conspiracy theories in the Middle East, which really can be paralyzing, is for this process to move forward and for people to say, no, let's have the great debates. Let's have the Brotherhood in. Let's let it roll. So again, I don't think that the United States shouldn't shy away. Don't have the illusion that the Brotherhood is going to be your friend. It's not. But we should say very forcefully what the type of Egypt we would like to see. You know, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And we should be very forthright about wanting to support liberal values. But we should not want to have a restrictive system inside of Egypt where the Brotherhood is essentially thrown out, because that's the fastest way you're going to disqualify all the liberals too. I mean, I think I have my differences with Saad Ibrahim, but I think on that one he's absolutely right. And when he tells you that the only way liberals can have legitimacy in Egypt is for fundamentalists to be in the electoral debate and to be in the political system, I think he's absolutely right. And I will just mention one thing. I mean, a friend of mine just came back from Egypt not that long ago. He was with McCain and Lieberman, and they were meeting with dissidents, unlike our Secretary of State, and that uniformly the people that he met with underscored the importance of Libya to the future of Egypt, and underscored the need for the United States to help take a stand and to stop Gaddafi from retaking the country. And that if the forces of reaction triumph in Libya, that the ramifications of that in Egypt will likely not be small and they will not be good.
Well, I was going to segue to Bahrain, but maybe I will segue to Bahrain and we'll save Libya for the end. Bahrain is another one of these places where I feel like the U.S. and the administration, outside the administration, went into a kind of panic lest Shia overthrow our friendly Sunni government there. But now we have the Saudis crossing the causeway. One of the fears before this happened was that the Shia were somehow Iranian stooges. I wonder how you see things at this moment. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Michelle, with the situation in Bahrain and U.S. policy?
Okay. Well, I mean, this problem in Bahrain has been waiting to happen for a long time, right? The government there, the Sunni monarchy, has been promising reform for a decade now. Has significantly under-delivered, and this is definitely one of those political systems in which you have an elected parliament in which the opposition and so forth can be represented, but it has no power, and all the power sits in the hands of the ruling family. And you've got an opposition in Bahrain that actually is strong, is much stronger than the opposition in most Arab countries, because it draws its strength from the 70% of the population that are Shiite, as well as some of the Sunnis. And so, you know, and we have a situation in which the ruling family, I think, has been pushing actually the Shiite population for years now. I mean, they've actually been trying to tilt the demographic balance in the country by extending Bahraini nationality to Sunni Muslims from a lot of other countries. It's a small enough country, only about 500,000 native Bahrainis, that by extending nationality to tens of thousands of people, you actually can change the government. I often say this is the only country in the Middle East where instead of the people trying to reform the government's been trying to reform the people. You know, we'll just change you and then things will be better. Well, that hasn't worked. It's created tremendous tensions inside the society. And then the ruling family pushed things further over the summer by arresting most of the Shiite opposition. They've now had to release those people as a concession, but I wasn't surprised at all to see things really blow up in Bahrain. And the United States now, you know, as we saw with Egypt, is having to dance pretty fast to figure out what its policy is, because for a long time the United States has really in its policy just completely ignored this whole thing going on in Bahrain. You know, we have our naval base there, the Fifth Fleet. We have good relations with the Bahraini ruling family, and we just left it at that. Now we're having to take into account what's going on in the country. Now, you know, the United States initially had some success in persuading Bahraini ruling family to step back from the brink a bit and not to use as much force against the demonstrators, but that's now been reversed. And we've seen not only Saudi and Emirati troops come in, but a lot of force used against the demonstrators just in the last 24 hours. And it doesn't seem like we're having a lot of success in persuading the Bahraini ruling family to carry out real reforms. I mean, I was happy to see what Secretary Gates said, that it's going to take more than baby steps, and we're now starting to hear this. We weren't even hearing this from U.S. officials until a few days ago, that real reforms are necessary, that, you know, the ruling family needs to make some real concessions. Power needs to be shared in a different way. That doesn't mean that the United States is calling for the ruling family to go, but simply that they carry out the kind of reforms that they've long promised and not done. But the problem here, of course, is that there's a major factor, the Saudis, weighing in on the other side. And the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are now at loggerheads here over what's going to happen in Bahrain. And it's really a bad situation, and it comes of having ignored what was going on inside that country for a very long time now.
Well, I'm sure you're familiar with the argument, which is that, you know, there's an Iranian state waiting to happen here. That's why you know, if you read the New York Times story, another relatively simplistic story about pragmatism versus idealism, the pragmatic solution is hold on to this regime, back them, because the alternative is an Iranian, you know, proxy. How should we feel about the Shia in Bahrain, where they're going, and that approach, and thinking about things that way?
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Bahrain is considered in Iran to be one of its great failures, and that the Iranian influence in the Shia community in Bahrain has actually been quite small. However, I would say that if the Bahrain royal family continues to go down the path it's going, that they may actually be able to reverse Tehran's quite limited penetration in the Shia society there. I mean, for someone of a medieval disposition like myself, I find all this amusing, because if you go back and you read the classics of Islamic history, most of them will give you the distinct impression Sunni good, Shia bad. And most of them will give you the impression that the Ajam, the Shia of the Arab world, are in fact somehow in league with the Iranians. And it gets to be quite surreal. I remember being in Baghdad once, being with members who were following Sadr, Muqtada Sadr. And I mean, these people actually did have some connection with the Iranians, but the dominant discussion amongst them was how much they hated the Iranians and how the Iranians lorded over them. This notion that the Arab Shia of Bahrain are a fifth column for the Iranians, I think, is surreal. Now, it is also absolutely true that if they have no choice and they have Saudis coming in with truncheons and bullets, that they will look upon the Iranians a hell of a lot more fondly. And anyone who's been to Bahrain and who has seen the Shiite ghettos there knows how bad it is and knows how morally repugnant are the arguments that you often hear amongst the Sunni elite who tell you that the only reason they're poor is because, well, they just don't have a good work ethic. And they usually say that as they're getting out of their BMWs, getting ready to dive into their pools. So, I mean, it is a perverse situation there. And this, I would agree with Michelle, this was destined to explode. And I don't see this ending well. I mean, it's very, because I don't see how the Khalifa family gets to transition this into a constitutional monarchy where essentially, you know, they can maintain, you know, their power. I just don't see how it happens. I think if it's going to move to a democratic system or any type of representative system, they're going to have to give up a substantial amount of the power that they've enjoyed. The Sunni minority is going to have to give up a substantial amount of the power, the privileges that they've enjoyed. And they will, I don't see that happening. So I'm at a loss with Bahrain, I have to confess, and I see the United States actually being in a situation because of our base there, which is important, of us coming down on the side of what could turn out to be quite soon a really ugly bloodbath.
Go ahead, Michelle. Yep.
Just a word on the base. The U.S. base in Bahrain has not been an issue with the opposition.
Yeah.
You do not see, you know, the Shiite in Bahrain, you know, demonstrating against the U.S. base or anything like that. But, you know, that if depending on what position the U.S. takes here, that could be an issue in the future. Last week there was a small demonstration in front of the U.S. Embassy with the Shia, you know, calling on the U.S. to take a position more in favor of them. It was kind of a fairly friendly little demonstration. Donuts were served by the U.S. Embassy. But you know, it was a warning sign because in all the other demonstrations we've seen in Arab countries, you don't see anybody going to the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. hasn't been an issue. But in Bahrain, you know, they realized that the Shia realized that, you know, the U.S. position is an issue. They've tried not to, you know, call the United States an enemy and so forth. Obviously, with Saudi Arabia weighing in on the side of the monarchy, they want the U.S. to weigh in on their side. So they're trying, but that's, you know, that's going to be an issue, and the, you know, whether or not we could keep the base there is could become more of an issue if the U.S. isn't seen as.
I mean, I just add something, and that is an excellent testimony to what I would call this very powerful disposition that you see not only in Bahrain but other places, but Bahrain is a wonderful example of that there is still this expectation the United States is supposed to support democracy, and they actually still think that, which will make it a crying shame if this continues in the direction that I think it's going to go, where the United States is going to get in a very ugly bind as those Saudi forces are let loose.
Let me just press on one issue before we turn to Libya and then to your questions. You know, I said at the beginning that a lot of this is going to affect how President Obama is viewed, but obviously President Obama did not invent U.S. policy toward these countries. These policies have been in place for decades. He had the misfortune, potentially good fortune, but also the misfortune to be the guy on whose watch these things blew up. But there has been in the U.S. government a long string of policy experts in the Middle East Bureau of the State Department, at the NSC, in the Pentagon, people who have expertise in these countries, people who've been following these developments over the years. I mean, whatever one may think about President Obama, what is it about our special class of people who look at these issues that they missed these developments? We talked about how Egypt seemed at least to be on the boil. You just mentioned how Bahrain was, both of you agree, was destined to blow up, and yet you don't see any sign of real policy response coming out of the bureaucracy that's supposed to be monitoring things. It's not President Obama's job to know what's going on in Bahrain at any given moment. So is there something to be said about mindsets, about institutional understandings here? Who was the last person? Maybe Michelle, you might want to address this. You worked with in this system for quite some time.
Well, there are many volumes to be spoken about this. I won't bore you with all of them now.
We won't be bored.
But I will say one thing about this. I felt very frustrated in my years, in the State Department and so forth, with the failure of U.S. diplomats to think strategically, and their confrontation avoidance, kind of behavior. They could take on no problem before it's time. All we do is put out the fires of today, and we never think about what might be coming. And also, I think their failure to look at the tools that the U.S. has at its disposal, and how to use them in relationships. I'll just tell you one anecdote. At one point, I think it was when I was on the NSC staff, the State Department has to send this report to Congress every 5 years or so, where they actually talk about what the State Department does, and I don't know, it's something. So for some reason, somebody asked me if I would read it and give them feedback on it. It was being written. So I read the thing, and I said to the person who wrote it, this is not really what you're going to send, right? And he said, why? I said, well, it says here that the job of the U.S. Department of State is to cultivate good relations with other countries. And he said, yeah. And I said, wouldn't it be to promote U.S. interests abroad? And that, sometimes that would involve cultivating good relations with other countries, but sometimes it would involve confrontation or other things. I said, the problem is you've been too honest in this report. You've said what you really do.
Well, and in the case of the Middle East, sorry to interrupt, but hasn't that meant cultivating good relations with the leader of these countries?
With the leader, with the government.
What kind of job has the State Department done cultivating relationships with other people in, say, Egypt or in Bahrain?
No, other people, it's mostly, that's a reporting officer's job, to go out and speak to people in the opposition and so forth, to know what they're thinking, so you can write some cables and send it back. That's, that happens at
Did
that
we have
level.
good contacts at the ambassador level in Egypt with opposition figures? No.
No, look, I'm not saying that they didn't meet with anybody, in the opposition. Of course they did, and the ambassador would hold dinners and invite people from time to time and so forth. But no, those are not, the way these relationships are run. It's government to government, and it's working with the host government. And I have found in the past that the closer you get to the ground, in other words, when you start dealing with the U.S. diplomats and the USAID people who are actually in country, they are the ones who are most confrontation averse, because they have to deal with those officials every day, and those officials make their lives difficult if they're pushing them or disagreeing with them, so they don't want to do that. They think that their job there is to grow that relationship, the government-to-government relationship, and make it happy and reach new agreements and that kind of thing. And that's what the system rewards them for.
Do you want to expound on this as a broad theoretical matter, or our way of understanding this? Maybe pull it back from the bureaucracy a little bit and just talk about our way of understanding this part of the world, our American way of understanding it.
Well, I just say, that it's not that theoretical, that, little things matter a lot. And I would just emphasize again, I went to Bahrain once to visit a friend of mine, a Foreign Service officer, and I do have this irrationally, totally unjustified affection for Foreign Service officers. And, he spent his entire day, having to work with the government. And at the end of his time there, the king gave him a solid gold Rolex watch, which, of course, being the good Foreign Service officer, he gave it back with the added quip, if it had only been a Patek Philippe. This individual was disposed towards the Shia. But that's not the way he could actually write it up. He couldn't go out and spend time with Shia. That's just not the way it's done. He would have gotten himself into trouble. He would have caused problems for the embassy, the political section, everything. So it's just, you can't expect actually reporting officers and people in the field to be all that illuminating. It's always very difficult to run against the mainstream current. And like I said before, people get frozen in time. It's natural. And so the general discussions about the Middle East, the general discussions about the Arab world or the Iranian world often get locked. Our reflexes get built up and they may not have anything to do with the way it is today, but it's extremely difficult to, to break that analysis, to break the reflexes which have become so instinctive and accepted. I just don't know how you get around it. I think the bureaucracies always have that, and that's why if you're the President of the United States, you should always have people who are not in the bureaucracy also helping you.
Okay. Let's do a couple minutes on Libya, then I'll open it up to questions. Another part of the allegedly pragmatic approach that the administration is supposed to be taking to the region is to see each separate country individually and not try to deal with this in a collective. And I saw that Khalilzad criticized that approach. But in the case of Libya, I think you already mentioned, you mentioned that the Egyptians' opposition cares what's happening in Libya. First question is, how important is the outcome in Libya to the overall evolution of the region, as well as their view of U.S. policy? Maybe, Michelle, you'd like to start with that.
Well, I might be a little more optimistic than Ruel or the person you quoted, Ruel, was about the ability of Egypt and Tunisia to continue to proceed toward democratic transitions, even if Libya turns into a disaster, which unfortunately looks very likely. I mean, it already is a rolling disaster. So I might be a little bit more optimistic about that. However, when we talk about then the further, demonstration effect in the region, clearly the fact that we would see now two other examples, Libya and Bahrain, in which initially peaceful oppositions were met with very strong use of force, and that then the international community tolerated it, maybe criticized it a bit, but was not able to pull itself together to do anything about it. That everyone's going to learn from that. Opposition movements are going to learn from that, and even more importantly, other leaders are going to learn from that they can get away with this. Look, I mean, I understood the administration's slowness in moving forward on Libya better a couple of weeks ago than I understand it now. I mean, initially, of course, it would have been desirable for this thing to be resolved inside of Libya itself. It would be desirable not to have foreign intervention, and it was desirable, and we did finally get a clear signal from the Arab League as well as the GCC about intervention in Libya and so forth being acceptable. It's really hard to understand now. I mean, with all the difficulties that are involved. It's really hard to understand how slowly we're moving, and Gaddafi is moving very, very quickly. I'm very fearful of what's going to happen in Benghazi, and we're looking at, I think, 48 hours, not much more than that. The time has just run out on this.
Ruel, do you want to comment on Libya in general, in any way?
Well, I mean, I actually agree with Michelle. I think the indices in Egypt are actually pretty good. I'm not that depressed about Egypt. I'm worried about the military, but I actually think that and I hesitate to say this because I recently got into a debate with Fuad Ajami on this, of the force and power a culture can have when authoritarian politics is aligned against it. And I actually do think in Egypt, as in Iran, you are seeing this actually upwelling, this enormous, I would argue, irresistible upwelling of a cultural rejection for the established political order. And that the culture is now, despite the fact being distorted, warped by decades of authoritarian rule, is actually trying to, in some ways, to heal itself. And I'm fairly optimistic about that. I mean, I have to say, on Egypt, I'm just at a loss here because Libya. I'm just at a loss here. I mean, this, in my mind, is just a no-brainer. It's a fairly straightforward, just for the simple fact that Muammar Gaddafi slaughtered Americans as if they were sheep not that long ago. that warrants him falling from power. He does not get a pass on that, and that we would allow an individual who has so relentlessly deployed terrorism against the United States in the past a pass is just inexcusable. I would have had the CIA paramilitary trained teams into Benghazi weeks ago to help them with the tutorials on how to use the weaponry that they need to stop those tanks and other armored vehicles. It's not that hard, and the notion that we could, by doing that, we would suddenly be in a war where we'd have to have 150,000 troops, I just find surreal. I don't, if those arguments are even sincerely proffered, then those individuals, I think, should be dismissed. It is just this. We could do something, but I think the number of days left for us to do something are quite limited. You've got to do something to stop that armor.
Okay, I think there's plenty to chew on, and happy to take as many questions as we can in the remaining time that we have. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dan Pollock from the Zionist Organization of America. I can't tell you how happy I am to have gone through this entire discussion without everyone focusing on Israel for once. But in regard to the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, their Palestinian branch is Hamas, and they seem to have missed the playbook that says that democracy is an already decided thing. They haven't had more elections, and some people characterize it as one person, one vote, one time. How do we avoid that type of scenario, and why is it that that plays out that way in Gaza? And is the throwing away of the old constitution, which might occur, is that a troubling precedent for democracies? In the future, are we going to find that a democratic Egypt is easily usurped if the constitution can be discarded so easily?
Let me take a couple of questions, and then you can. So you're going to remember that question. Somebody had their hand up over. Did you change your mind? Okay, go ahead.
My question is about
Could you identify yourself? It's just easier for us.
Karen Bohan from Reuters. My question is about Libya, and I'd like you to elaborate a little more on how this may play out. What are going to be the real consequences for the United States, in addition to a loss of momentum for the Arab Spring that may come about if Gaddafi crushes this rebel movement? What are going to be the consequences of Libya being there, Gaddafi knowing that Obama has called for his ouster, and what is that situation going to be like? And also, do you have any theories about what the White House thinking on this is? Obama last week repeated his call for Gaddafi to leave, but they have been awfully quiet as the intensity of the effort to crush the rebels has heated up.
Okay. Well, that was several questions. So let's stop there. Ruel, why don't you answer you want to take the Hamas question, and then Michelle take the Libya question.
Well, I mean, Palestinian politics are particularly perverse. Would that the democratic process had actually got going in the Palestinian community sooner, not later. I mean, you've got the unique situation of a divided land, where you have essentially two warring authoritarian parties going at it. Now, I would like to see elections return to both the West Bank and to Gaza. And I think the only way out of this is through elections. You know you're not going to get out of it through military domination of either Fatah or Hamas. Hamas was born in part because the entire Palestinian political order was spiritually bankrupt. It is quite understandable, that's true not only in the Palestinian community, it's throughout the Middle East, that a great part of why fundamentalist organizations grow and breathe and thrive is because the established order has lost all legitimacy and has become, to a substantial number of people, morally repugnant. And so you naturally go back to your primary root, your primary identity, which is Islamic. So again, the key here is evolution. I would argue that the best thing in the world for the Palestinians is to actually have the great debate in Egypt about its relations and its treaty with Israel. The hope for Hamas, that's the wrong way to put it perhaps, is for the Muslim Brotherhood to actually seriously have to deal with the democratic polity in Egypt. I think the effect of that on the Muslim Brotherhood globally will not be insignificant if Egypt can continue to move forward and the Muslim Brotherhood is an active participant in Egyptian politics. This will not make the Muslim Brotherhood into a pro-American organization. It will not make the Muslim Brotherhood certainly into a pro-Israeli organization. But it will start the evolution in the great debates that really haven't happened, certainly not in Hamas land, where there are virtually no debates at all.
Okay, Michelle, do you want to?
Yeah, regarding Libya, I mean, obviously, you know, Gaddafi's forces are gaining day by day, and the big target is Benghazi. That's the heart of the Libyan opposition now. It's a traditional seat of opposition to Gaddafi. And we heard Saif al-Islam Gaddafi say today that they're going to be there within 48 hours. And that is really a frightening situation because I think that's going to be a very tough battle, a very bloody battle. We're already seeing Gaddafi's forces beginning to round up and arrest lots of people in the towns where they've managed to, you know, recapture from the rebels. So we're looking at a disastrous, you know, human rights situation here. We don't even know how many people have been killed in Libya, several thousand at least already, and there will be a lot more, assuming Gaddafi's forces get to Benghazi, and lots of arrests. And then now, how long? So let's say Gaddafi wins militarily, so to speak, and manages to take over. How long would he be able to stay in control? I don't know. I think Libya will be a very unstable place. And the other thing I fear is that if he manages to hang on for a good while longer, then we're going to see a reversal possibly of the gains the United States made with Libya back in 2002, 2003, where, you know, we managed to convince Gaddafi to give up his ties to international terrorist groups and his weapons of mass destruction programs. I mean, I think that was the right thing to do back then, because think how much worse the situation would be right now if he had weapons of mass destruction and international terrorist groups at his disposal, right? He doesn't. But then obviously he can get back into those businesses again. I think that, you know, President Obama really has to think very seriously about saying that Gaddafi must go and then not making that stick. You know, what's the impact? There's the practical impact that I'm talking about, and then there's also the impact on, you know, the United States and its role and the president's role in the world and so forth.
I might add, it will be amusing to have the president talk about a Muslim outreach program after Benghazi falls and everyone's slaughtered. I await to hear how he talks about Muslim outreach. I think it's going to be a tad tricky, even for someone who's rhetorically gifted.
Yes, sir, over here.
Thank you. My name is Ibrahim Hussein. I'm an Egyptian American, and I am a member of Alliance of Egyptian Americans. I have one quick comment, then a question. The comment, Bob, you and Michelle wrote an excellent piece on March 7th in the Washington Post with specific recommendations as far as U.S. policy. Any movement on this? And the other question, again, Michelle mentioned that here in the United States, we're having trouble in strategic objectives. How much of this has to do with the 2-year or 4-year election cycle? Can the United States develop a policy that will take 10 years to be fully implemented, either in foreign policy or in the economy? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to deflect the first question because the answer is the United States is not very good at long-term strategy and never has been. So unless it's set up in a very easy way for us. And maybe let you quickly answer what did Hillary Clinton bring to Egypt yesterday, which I think gets to one of the things, yeah.
Right. So yeah. Well, so Secretary Clinton did bring kind of a package of incentives, and it doesn't involve really new foreign aid. It involves a repackaging of some foreign aid, and then a much bigger, you know, possibility of credits through OPIC and so forth. So, look, it's a step. It's a first step. I mean, I think there's going to need to be a lot more. I think the U.S. is going to have to think seriously about our aid package to Egypt. As you know, we've been giving, 1.3 billion in military, 250 million in economic assistance. I think at this point that's the wrong balance, and that needs to be rethought and discussed, including with the Egyptian military leadership now. And I think that the international community will need to do a lot more to help Egypt with its transition. Just briefly on the question of strategy, although it's true that it's difficult for the United States to pursue long-term objectives, I mean, that isn't always the case. I mean, there have been some things, whether it's, pursuing Arab-Israeli peace or the Cold War or whatever. I mean, they weren't always pursued successfully, but there have been some of these long-term objectives that the United States has managed to pursue in one way or another from administration to administration.
Including supporting dictators in the Middle East for 30 years. That was a consistent strategy. Okay, we have time for a couple more. Let's go to this side here. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jason Stern. I'm from George Washington University. If you look at de-Baathification in Iraq, it seems in the zeal to remove all the remnants of the Saddam regime, you had a few negative side effects. Most notably, you pushed fence-sitters and potential allies into the insurgency, and you also destroyed Iraq's human capital. With protesters in Egypt now demanding trials not only for all the state security agents, but also informants, is Egypt in danger of making the same mistakes that the U.S. and Iraq made after 2003? Thank you.
Okay, keep that one in mind. Over here, yes, ma'am, back there.
We've seen, on the one hand, the Iranian regime lauding protesters around the region, and at the same time increasing their oppression of protesters at home. I'm wondering what your take is on what the implications are of these changes for Iran.
The other country we didn't mention in the course of this conversation. Let me take one more, and then we'll, yes, sir. I have to ask a question of somebody who has headphones on.
Is she getting it translated?
Are you listening to Arcade Fire or something?
My name is Meredith Buell. I'm a correspondent with Voice of America, just back from several weeks in the Middle East. Wanted to ask you, you touched on this, but what is happening inside Saudi Arabia? What is driving the monarchy's decisions there to send these troops into Bahrain? What influence is there concern about Iran having on this, and what is the status of U.S.-Saudi relations?
Good. Why don't we start with Saudi, move on to what is the effect on Iran, and then the quick on the de-Baathification question. Who wants to take the Saudi question first? Anybody yearning to do so?
I think, I mean, you can say this, the Saudis, perhaps above all things in life, the Saudis hate the Shia. Second, they're not terribly fond, obviously, of any type of, democratic order. What's going on in Bahrain, let alone elsewhere, just terrifies them. And they've always got the Eastern Province in mind. And so the Saudis are taking a very hard line on this, which is what we should expect from them. So I don't see anything pleasant happening there. Saudis may eventually, I've made this argument a few times, that eventually they may get caught up in this, that the Saudis are lucky in that they don't really have a democratic movement coming out for them from the left, because all the Saudis that we know who go to the West and are educated, they're still more or less bought off in the system, and they can have a certain level of hypocrisy and get to the West and live a life, and money does matter, and so you haven't had develop a real powerful movement on the left, and you don't really yet have a religious movement, democratic movement on the right, because you've got the Wahhabi establishment, which is, of course, virulently anti-democratic and virulently anti just about everything. That situation might change in the future, where you may actually do get a pincer movement, both from the left and the right, but I don't see that in the short term. But they are going to obviously continue to support the hardest line possible in Bahrain, and I suspect the United States will continue to try to ignore all that because of our long-standing love of their oil.
Well, let's ask that. Let me ask you that, Michelle, to sharpen the question a little bit. I mean, what should the U.S. be doing? Here's Saudi Arabia sending force in to support a neighboring dictatorship that the United States thinks should be undergoing reform. What can and should the United States be saying, doing vis-a-vis the Saudis at this moment?
Yeah, what the United States has been doing is calling for restraint and so forth. Now, what's going on behind the scenes, I don't know, but I really think the United States should have taken a stronger stand against the sending in of external troops, because it's a dangerous situation. It really does raise the temperature in Bahrain. Now, on the political side of this, I think, at least, from what Secretary Gates said, it seems as though the United States is taking more the position that it should. And here's where the argument is. The United States is saying to the Bahraini monarchy, bend so that you won't break. And the Saudis are saying, don't bend or you'll break. So that's the argument right now. I mean, it's two different ways of looking at making concessions. Will they lead you to be able to remain in power, or will they lead to a slippery slope? So that's the argument there.
Let me just, you want to take a quick shot at the Baathification, Egypt question, and then let's end on Iran.
Both Tunisia and Egypt are facing these questions about, how much of the old regime can and should be preserved in the new era. And this is always the case after revolutions, and we're not even in the post-revolutionary period. These revolutions are still going on. Egyptians are going to have to figure out a way. Now, there certainly are people who were associated with the old regime in some way, who managed either during the actual uprising or shortly thereafter to associate themselves with it in a way that has given them a pass. And they're now okay, in the new revolutionary period. But there are a lot who didn't, and I think it really depends on the extent of hard feelings against those people, the extent to which people know that they were involved in corruption or torture or intimidation, that kind of thing. That's going to be, but this is something that Egyptians are going to have to fight through. They're going to have to figure out whether they really want to go after Mubarak, for example, and all the way down. I think you're quite right that this can go down to a low level of your local police officer and so forth. And they're going to have to decide where it should stop so that they can move forward in a new era.
We've gone over, but so in a relatively brief, do you want to address the question of what effect is all this going to have in Iran?
Very quickly put, though I'll preface it by saying I like de-Baathification. On Iran, I think the Great Arab Revolt is a nightmare for the Iranians, and the surreal opening commentary that this is the prelude to Islamic revolutions throughout the entire Middle East. I mean, I don't think anyone in Iran took it seriously, let alone anywhere else. So, I mean, this, if it moves forward and elsewhere in the Arab world, particularly if it just moves forward in Egypt, I think Tehran is in deep trouble. I think they know that. And I would go on to even suggest that there is a mystical union between what happens in Egypt to what happens in Iran. And that if Egypt goes democratic, I think the effect of that on Iran, it will be profound. And the thing to always remember about Iran, it is an enormous volcano. And it could blow at any time. The Green movement, which we totally discounted, thought was dead, came back alive. This will happen over and over again until the regime goes down. So I would just suggest to you that this Iran is looking at this with, the regime is looking at it with great trepidation.
Well, thanks very much. I know there was a lot more questions, but you've now got another panel of experts to address those questions too. It's an excellent panel with Bill Crystal and Elliot Abrams and Aaron Miller. So we're not going down too far in quality for the next group. Can I just ask you to join me in thanking Michelle and Noel for an excellent presentation.
One country to another, there are some exceptions to this rule, but this is just sort of describing the general picture. And I would say what we're seeing is that this model is dying. It may not be completely dead yet, but it's on its way out. And that leaders in just about every Arab country have felt the push to change in one, either go or to change in one way or another. And we see them responding in various ways. And I guess we'll be discussing that, you know, how they're responding. Now, the protests and the demanders of protesters in various Arab countries have differed a little bit from one place to another, but there are some very important common threads. One of them is that protesters have started connecting all different kinds of grievances. A lot of them were economically based grievances. We know about the youth bulge and youth unemployment and so forth. Economic grievances, social grievances, human rights grievances have become connected to political grievances. And that wasn't the case in a lot of places until recently. And we've seen larger numbers of people get behind specific grievances and unite behind a goal of changing the political system in some way, whether that involved changing the leadership or carrying out significant reforms. And this is specifically what is challenging this model that I mentioned of, you know, an unelected, all-powerful executive and relatively powerless elected bodies and legislatures. Now, I guess we're going to get a little bit more. I was going to say some things about specific countries.
Go ahead.
I guess we'll get into that a little bit more. But obviously, we're seeing a lot of difference in terms of how strong protests are in various countries, how the leaderships are responding to them. And we've only seen two countries that are actually on the road to transition: Tunisia and Egypt. They're very, very, very important. Egypt, especially so. And I guess we'll have a chance to discuss that more.
Okay, good. Well, we can get down to specifics, which actually will flesh out what the general argument is as well. But why don't you go ahead, Ruel, and then we can work into that.
Well, just to dovetail with what Michelle said, I mean, I just focus on one little issue, and then we can go from there, and that is, you know, the role that Islamists are going to play, and the great fear that so many have of them in the Middle East. I mean, I'd say this: I am astonished when I talk to some of my old professors who are enormously knowledgeable about the region, and I feel as if they're frozen in time, and I feel that the discussion about the Middle East, and particularly Islam in the Middle East, is stuck somewhere between 1948 and 1979. And that we haven't really gotten over the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and it has distorted our view of what I think is taking place, certainly throughout the Arab world and definitely in Iran. And the most important thing to remember is that the Islamists have, like everybody else in the region, have been going through this enormous evolution. And that if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood today, there is no way you can compare it to the Muslim Brotherhood when it was originally formed, or even the Muslim Brotherhood from 30 years ago. Now, we do not know where various Islamist organizations in the Arab world are going to go, all right? But we do have a very good idea, for example, where Islamist groups, Islamist intellectuals have gone in Iran. Now, the Iranians have had the benefit of a revolution. That definitely causes the mind to think in certain ways. But one thing is certainly clear that we've seen in Iran, and that is there are relatively few Islamist intellectuals left. That those that embraced, that made the revolution, most of them have fallen away from the central truths of the revolution. They've certainly backed away from the idea of theocracy. Now, I think if you look at the Arab world is not nearly as rich in the discussion about these issues, about man and God, that we've seen in the Iranian world. The Iranian world is just unique in the quantity of the discussion, the depth of the discussion, the richness of the discussion. But if you do look at the Arab world, you can see it. You can see them trying to, Islamists primarily having to struggle with the idea of what do you do with the democratic mandate? What do you do with the Sharia? How do you adjust? And to put it very briefly, there is this general consensus that I think has developed, and that is that sovereignty can only come through the ballot box. Now, Islamists can argue about what laws should be, supreme, what things in the Sharia must we have, and if we don't have them, the society is in deep doo-doo. But the notion that a vote must take place, that there is no political order which is legitimate without a vote, I think is now almost uniform. And the discussion that you often have in the West where it says, oh, really, what the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is after is establishing a caliphate, and they don't really want to get involved in the democratic process. I just suggest to you, it's surreal. It's not true. Now, that doesn't mean that the Muslim Brotherhood are going to be liberal Democrats. It doesn't mean the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be in favor of the United States. It doesn't say the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be in favor of Western social rights. Far from it. But it is now deep inside of the political body that, in fact, they believe that democracy is the only way.
Responsive to to the demands, and they're changing, they're evolving all the time, that we're seeing from the protesters and the opposition, and that the military leadership should not be, rigid in the kind of timetable and so forth that it puts in place. I wanted to say one word about what Ruel said about the Islamists, which I agree with, and. Look, you're absolutely right that there's been a big change in the Islamists, and that the idea of democratic government is now widely accepted. I'm thinking of a long series of books that the Islamist intellectual, you probably know him, Fahmy Houedi in Egypt, wrote this, 10-volume series called Islam and Democracy about a decade ago, trying to convince Islamists that democratic government was consonant with Islam. Nobody would write that anymore because the argument's over. We keep having the argument here about them, but amongst themselves, in fact, this argument is over. When you get into the fine points, the argument still goes on, and I agree it's a productive argument and it needs to go on. I also would point out, I said at the beginning of my talk that society had been on the move in Arab countries, and one of the ways in which it's been on the move is that there is a liberal trend. If you look 20 years ago or 10 years ago, to be a serious oppositionist in an Arab country meant to be an Islamist. That's not necessarily the case anymore. Islamists, are a significant part of the opposition, but they have a lot more competition now from different political groups, and especially from liberals.
Well, let's talk about the Brotherhood and what they're doing right now. I know some very suspicious Republican friends of mine are saying they're playing it perfectly. They're trying not to look threatening, and then they go off on a long stream about how the Bolsheviks and this and all that. One thing that does seem to be interesting is the at least de facto alliance between the military government and the Brotherhood on how to proceed. Most of the opposition groups are opposing the referendum. The Brotherhood seems to be favoring it. They seem to be favoring this process. I've also at least read about younger members of the Brotherhood not necessarily wanting there to be only one party. Maybe there should be more than one Islamist party. What is happening right now with the Brotherhood in Egypt?
That's a great question. I think the Brotherhood is in a serious state of convulsion in the sense that I don't think they really know where they're going. If you look at someone like Mohammed Badia, the head of the Brotherhood, the man is about, as I would argue, as lost about where the future of Egypt is as is the Minister of Defense. That both of them have about the same level of clairvoyance. So I think the Brotherhood has benefited, obviously, to say what should be obvious, is they've benefited enormously from the situation that in Egypt under Mubarak. They really were the only, quote, legitimate opposition, you might say. And if you really did want to demonstrate against the regime, the Brotherhood was the place to go. It was a place where you could actually find people of differing views, and you could find people who weren't paid off by the regime. All of that is over now. So, we have certainly seen younger members of the Brotherhood express their limited dismay with senior members of the Brotherhood. Now, we haven't seen a big, wide open debate. I think we've seen signs of that there are definitely fissures, that if you had a more open system, then those fissures might turn into giant cracks and you could have a lava flow. But until it actually moves forward, I think the discipline of the Brotherhood will probably be sufficient to maintain many of the conspiracies that many people cherish, that the Brotherhood is in fact this organization that's quite capable of stealing the entire political system. I don't think that's true, though I will be very frank. I think the Brotherhood, if it plays its cards correctly and can get younger people out there, that the Brotherhood has the chance of doing pretty well in any election. I would be shocked if they got less than 25%, and I think it's conceivable that they could get upwards of 40%. So I think it's a mistake. I mean, these societies, and I agree with Michelle, these societies, the liberal element, particularly in Egypt, is a lot greater than I think many people have given credit. The liberal traditions in Egypt, I think, though battered badly, I think can recover fairly quickly. But with that said, one must say that Egypt is a profoundly conservative society. It's a very conservative social society, and the Brotherhood is going to, religious parties in general, we'll see what happens with the Brotherhood down the road, how vociferous it is, can do well. So we should not be shocked to see the Brotherhood do a lot better than what some people in Egypt say it will do, and that is, 10 or 15% of the vote. If they only get 10 or 15% of the vote, I mean, then, pop the champagne bottles, because then you really do have a much more competitive society than I think is the case.
Well, let's finish up on Egypt by talking a little bit about U.S. policy. I had the impression, being here, that
this change, which is going to be convulsive, I think, to get to the end of this. But there's no doubt that that process could be very disruptive, and you're going to have, I would predict, a great deal of difficulty for American foreign policy.
Well, as much as we were tempted to have general conversations, we are dealing with specific situations where all this is in fact evolving. So maybe we should take a look at some specific countries, and let's focus on, at least, I think what we agree is certainly the most important country as far as the success or failure of the Arab Spring is concerned, and that's Egypt. Let me get back to Ruel, because I do want to, let's put your thesis to the test and say what is going on with the Muslim Brotherhood right now. But before we get, and I'll pose that question in a second, but before we get to that, where do you see things going now, right this minute and in the months to come, Michelle? What kind of process do you think Egypt ought to go through? What kind of process do you think it is likely to go through?
Well, I think the most important thing to know is that Egypt is in a continuing revolution. I mean, it's not that it was over, on February 11th when Mubarak was forced out of office. This is a process that's going on, and things are changing a lot week by week in Egypt. So, Egypt has a military council, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, that is in effect sitting in place of the presidency until elections are held, and both houses of parliament have been dissolved. The leadership, the transitional leadership, did, I think, probably the most important thing they've done since asking Mubarak to step aside yesterday, which was they dissolved the internal security apparatus, the state security investigations apparatus. This is not the regular police and so forth. These are the secret police. And they've said that some sort of new, much more limited body is going to be formed in its place, and it's not going to be getting involved in peaceful politics and in the personal lives of citizens and so forth. Now, we'll have to see, but at least, announcing this change is a very important step, because if that had not changed, even if they had managed to hold free elections and so forth, but the secret police had still been there getting involved in everybody's lives and harassing harassing and torturing people and so forth, then there would have been no change. So that was really an essential step. And Tunisia did the same thing just about a week before that. That's really important. The other big important question now is the Constitution and the related question of elections. What the military leadership in Egypt wants to do is a very limited constitutional reform and then move very quickly to presidential and parliamentary elections. And it's not clear exactly what order they would be held in. The way the Constitution puts it, they should hold parliamentary elections first and then the presidential elections afterwards. But there's a lot of concern on the part of protesters and opposition forces in Egypt about moving very quickly to elections. There are all kinds of new political forces springing up. I mean, I'm literally hearing about one or more new political parties that are trying to form every day. And of course, they don't have time to organize themselves for elections in 3 months or even 6 months. The thing that's going to happen later this week is they're going to have a referendum on Saturday, unless for some reason they should cancel it, on a limited group of constitutional amendments that would basically just pave the way for holding free and fair parliamentary elections, but wouldn't carry out any basic changes in the political system. What we're seeing is a lot of the political forces in Egypt saying they're against a limited constitutional amendment and they would rather go down a different path, which is what Tunisia is now doing, which is scrap the whole constitution, convene a constituent assembly, and write the constitution over again and have sort of a longer, slower process before elections are actually held. The military council in Egypt doesn't want to do this because they want to hand over power. They're actually not eager to hold on to political power for, at least not overt political power, for a long time. So this is the struggle. We're going to have to see. It's really very hard to predict what's going to happen at this referendum on Saturday because Egypt literally has never held a free election before. You don't know how many people are going to vote. In past referenda, you would have 5% or fewer of eligible voters turning out. Now you have 45 million people eligible to vote. And if a lot of them, half or even a third of them turn out, I think it's going to be really difficult to handle. If the constitutional referendum passes this weekend, then they'll be on a path to holding elections, and there may be some negotiation about sort of which order they're held in and how many months. I think it would be better to hold the presidential election first. It's less complicated than the parliamentary elections. But if the referendum doesn't pass, then they may have to scrap this whole plan and move toward a constituent assembly or something like that. And in that case, the protesters and the opposition are going to push very hard for a change in the leadership, that it not be a military council alone that lead the country through the transitional period, but that there be a different kind of a presidential council that involves civilians along with the military.
Great. Well, that's very helpful. I take it you think the United States is right not to be opining on these issues.
Right. I mean, I think, the United States, needs to be, continuing to talk about the need for a real transition, continuing to talk about the need for the military leadership to be.
I'm Jamie Fly. I'm the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. I want to welcome everyone today. Thank you for coming to our two-panel conference on democratization in the Middle East, implications of the Arab Spring. For those of you not familiar with the Foreign Policy Initiative, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to the promotion of U.S. international engagement. We have several events throughout the year like this, and we also put out a number of other products and information about different foreign policy issues. You all should have received a folder today which has a number of our papers and open letters that we issue. I want to draw your attention to two recent letters that we've released, two open letters to President Obama regarding Libya, including one that came out yesterday. So you may find that to be interesting. We decided to do this conference because we wanted to frame the topic in a way that we could get beyond just kind of the daily discussion about specific countries. Libya is obviously in the news right now. Weeks ago it was Egypt, and discuss kind of broader trends about what's going on in the region with this Arab Spring that we've been seeing. So we are going to focus on some of the recent developments in each case, but also have a broader discussion about what's happening and what are the implications for U.S. policy. We're going to do that through two panels. The first is titled The Middle East and Transformation, and then we'll have a coffee break, and then at 2:30 we'll start with a panel on implications for U.S. policy. I'm going to turn it over now to Robert Kagan, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and one of our board members of the Foreign Policy Initiative, and he's going to introduce our panelists and get the discussion going.
Great, thanks, Jamie, and welcome to all of you. I don't know what it is with the front seats here. I guess it's frightening to be so close to us, but by the end you'll warm up, I think. Obviously, this is a timely discussion, and although we will be addressing broad topics, I think the broad topics have immediate implications. This is one of those moments in history that doesn't come along that frequently. I think it's very much akin to 1989 and the revolutions that we saw in Eastern Europe. Its impact, I think, on American foreign policy, American interests, and the world more generally will be as significant as 1989 as we look back on it. Unfortunately, I think things are very much up for grabs right now, what direction things are going in. Our two esteemed experts will go into that in greater detail. But a lot is riding on where things go now for the United States, and I would say also for President Obama. I think his reputation in foreign policy will be made or unmade on this issue. Presidents don't get to choose which issues define them, unfortunately. But they do have a way of creeping up and defining them. I think this is going to be a tremendous opportunity for President Obama, but also obviously a time of tremendous risk. So that having been said, let me first of all introduce both Michelle Dunn and Ruel Gerecht. I don't think, quite honestly, there are two better experts and scholars on this subject in the country or in the world. Michelle has a distinguished career in government, worked in the White House and the State Department, has a PhD in Arabic studies, something like that. What do you have a PhD in?
Arabic language.
Arabic language, even, which is always helpful, and knows this region incredibly well. She's also co-chair of the working group on Egypt, which had actually been warning about what we've seen in Egypt for quite some time. Next to Michelle is Ruel Gerecht. Also worked in the government, also a leading scholar, and I would say the most original scholar and thinker on evolution in the Islamic world, and particularly as it relates to the relationship between Islam and democracy. He has a new book coming out, but it's not listed. Is it listed here? What is it called?
The Wave.
The Wave, okay.
Man, God, and the Ballot Box.
And when is that coming out?
Well, they tell me 3 weeks.
3 weeks, just in time. Needless to say, this is one of those books that was written before everything that happened,
there
but
was
it's
a
not
wave.
going to come out until after everything that happened.
right.
You got to get that timing just right. Anyway, so I'm going to turn it over to Michelle first for a few minutes of opening remarks, and then Ruel, and then I will pose some questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So, Michelle, thanks very much.
Okay. Well, looking at the region broadly and what's going on there, and here I'm speaking primarily of the Arab countries. To me, what's been going on for some time now is that the societies and the governments have been going in two different directions. More specifically, the societies in a lot of Arab countries have been really experiencing a lot more vitality, activism, and so forth over the last 5 to 10 years. Notably, while the governments have been stagnant and sort of, unable to evolve. So we've seen this gap opening up, and that has presented quite a dilemma for the United States as it's become increasingly difficult to be on both sides at once, and the United States has had a lot of trouble choosing which side it's on. Most of the Arab countries have been operating for a long time on a model of leadership in which political power is concentrated in the hands of one person, whether it's a monarch or a president, but that person is not freely elected, not accountable via the ballot box. That person remains in office for life, or at least for many years, And in most cases, that person chooses his successor, in many cases, a son. And in most Arab countries, the parliaments have very little power and judiciaries don't have that much independence. Now, it varies a little bit from
to go, and that they need to participate in that. And I would just suggest that the primary problem we have in the Middle East is not the threat of some type of Islamist menace. It is the old regimes, the military and security apparatuses in each of these countries that will fight tenaciously to keep essentially the old order if you just cosmetically change it with the new. It's not the Islamists. What you want to see happen, if you fear Islamists, what you want to see happen is actually the democratic process to advance much more rapidly. You want to see elections. You want to see people have to write constitutions. And you want to see them have to confront all of these challenges. And what we have had, I mean, it's important to note, I mean, when I was going to school in Egypt in the late 70s and early 80s, you know, if you'd gone to the American University in Cairo at that time, you didn't see any women veiling. You know, these were the elite members of the society, and they were all decked out in wonderful, sexy, provocative clothing. You know, if you go back to the American University today, you know, after the great and glorious dictatorship of Mubarak, you find astonishing members of the elite, women, who have all the perks in life, who are voluntarily veiling. Now, why do they do that? Now, you know, religious cosmology aside, which differs from individual to individual, I just suggest to you that's happening because these women of the elite feel fundamentally ashamed of the current social political order. They are moving away from it. This process will continue if you have dictatorship, if you have authoritarian societies. It's only in that order that you actually do not have the type of evolution that we would like to see. What you want to see is you want to see a democratic system where they start arguing about these things. You want to see a democratic system where women of faith argue against women of secular disposition. You want to see that conflict. You want to see the head-on collisions. You want to see the debates get really nasty. The best debate that I could possibly imagine in the Egyptian parliament, the debate that would matter the most, is for them to have a debate, for example, about the treaty with Israel. That is something that is really valuable. You want to see them have a major, ugly debate about social questions, about the role of women, about Sharia. You want to see them have a tug of war and see how this comes out. It's entirely possible that some of these debates might not turn the way that we want them to turn. But I just suggest to you that in the long run, and maybe even the short run, it's going to be a lot better than anything we've seen before. And I would just note, I mean, in 1979, I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of women in Iran were all in favor of Khomeini, all right? And that is particularly true as you move it up the socioeconomic ladder. It is beyond a shadow of a doubt that if women actually, if their votes mattered, all right, the Islamic Republic as we know it would no longer exist. Now, it didn't take really all that long for the evolution to occur. And I just suggest to you that the evolution in the democratic world, in the Arab world, could be, if you actually do get this ball rolling, could be even much more rapid. It's entirely possible. It will certainly, I think, give results. It will make people responsible, and you'll likely see outcomes that may not be the ideal outcome for everybody in the West of a liberal disposition, but will be an outcome which the majority of Arabs in each country can live with and live with sufficiently well that you'll stop viewing the region as being permanently unstable. You'll stop viewing the region as being a giant generator of violence. And I think that is fundamentally what we want. We want to see the region where the people themselves have responsibility, and that basic instability that we've seen, which I think at root comes from a profound belief that all of these societies are unjust. That's really what it's about, is that from society to society to society, there is a basic sense of that the whole order is wrong. And I think the only way you get away from that is through the ballot box. And I just suggest to you that the vast majority of people there are quite willing to go there and quite sincerely want to test the whole system at the ballot box.
Well, thanks a lot. There's a lot to ask. Let me press you on one thing, though. This last point that you were making. I mean, isn't it an illusion, or isn't it a mistake to tell people that there is a stability lying ahead of us? Isn't it possible that there is no stability? That we're going to. Sam Huntington, who said a lot of things I didn't agree with, did say something smart about modernization, which is it's the change to change. It's the movement away from stasis to change. And couldn't we be entering a period of continual change and experimentation?
Oh, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, I think this process is going to be very convulsive. And as I said, I think you want to see that. I don't think, I mean, you want the Muslim world, you want the Arab world to sort of deal with modernity much more aggressively than it's been able to so far. I mean, there was this notion in the 1940s and the 1950s that sort of the Arab world could modernize basically on a Turkish model. That you could do it from the top down, and you would have dictatorships, and they'd bring in, and it would evolve eventually into a more liberal order. We haven't seen that, actually. We've seen the opposite of that. And so you need to actually have